The Zero dropped out of the low morning clouds like a wounded hawk, trailing a crooked ribbon of black smoke across the empty Philippine Sea. Its engine coughed, sputtered, then roared in uneven bursts, each one shaking the battered aircraft, like it was about to tear itself apart. Below, the steel deck of the USS Bogue shimmered in the rising sun. Sailors on the flight line froze mid-step as the silhouette formed overhead. Long nose, slender wings, the unmistakable predator shape every American had been trained to fear. K, Japanese, 0. Low, damaged. Coming straight toward them, 0. Inbound, low altitude. A lookout! Screamed alarms shrieked across the carrier. Gunners dashed to their stations. Ammunition belts clattered. Officers sprinted through the chaos. Every man expected the same thing, a kamikaze run, a last-ditch plunge into the deck. But then the impossible detail cut through the panic. The landing gear was down. What the hell? A gunner whispered. Stunned, the fighter wasn't diving. It wasn't accelerating. It wasn't attacking. It was lining up. Commander Harold Dixon raised binoculars with trembling hands, unable to believe what he was seeing. Hold fire, he barked, voice cracking with disbelief. Hold fire. The sailors hesitated, torn between instinct and the insane order, because no one, not a single man on that deck, had words for what they were witnessing. The Japanese pilot, alone, wounded, fighting a dying engine, was trying to land on an American aircraft carrier up in the cockpit. Ensign Tadayoshi Koga gripped the stick with both hands, sweat burning his eyes. The engine spat fire. The gauges sagged. The deck rushed toward him in a blur of steel and wind. He knew one truth. If he didn't land here, he would die in the sea. And so began the most impossible landing of the Pacific War. Ensign Tadayoshi Koga, barely 20, had taken off from Formosa just hours earlier for what was supposed to be a routine patrol. The morning sky had promised nothing but clouds and sun, but the Pacific had other plans. His wingman vanished in a sudden burst of fire, leaving Koga alone to navigate through. A sky suddenly filled with death. Every engine roar, every flash of tracer, reminded him how fragile his life had become. The Zero shuddered violently as bullets tore through its fuselage. Smoke curled from the engine, cowling, oil pressure dropped, and fuel lines threatened to sputter empty at any second. Koga dove into a cloud front, shaking the pursuing Hellcats, but in that haze, he realized he had lost everything. Bearings, radio, even the faintest idea of which island might provide sanctuary. The ocean below stretched endlessly, a merciless canvas of blue, offering nothing but a watery grave. His fingers clenched the stick, knuckles white. His breath came in ragged gasps. Every tactical decision he had ever made now boiled down to a single equation: survive or die. For a moment, he willed the clouds to part and reveal a friendly airfield, a strip of land, anything. Instead, his eyes caught a strange, massive shape on the horizon flat. Steel, enormous. His stomach twisted when the deck markings confirmed the impossible. It was American, a carrier, the USS Bogue. Panic surged, but Koga had no choice. Turning away meant certain death in the sea. Staying meant risking his life in enemy hands. Training, instinct, desperation, and the faint hope of survival guided him. He eased the throttle, lined up for approach, and whispered a silent prayer. Every heartbeat thundered. Every second counted. The stage was set. The Pacific had written the opening line of a story no one would believe. A Japanese pilot, a crippled Zero, and an American carrier poised to witness the impossible on the deck of the USS Bogue. The calm morning had already been broken by the first hints of chaos. Sailors hustled to their positions, engines roared to life, and alarms shrieked over the open sea. From the bridge, a lookout's voice cut through the clamor. Incoming aircraft. Low. 0. Damaged. Instantly, gunners swung into position, ammunition belts rattling. Eyes scanning the sky for the deadly silhouette that had haunted their nightmares since Pearl Harbor. The flight deck crew froze, uncertain. The approaching plane's trajectory didn't make sense. It wasn't diving at speed. It wasn't maneuvering like a kamikaze. And its landing gear was unmistakably down. Commander Harold Dixon grabbed his binoculars, heart pounding. He studied the approaching Zero. Every instinct screamed to fire. Yet something didn't add up. "Hold fire," he barked, voice cutting through the chaos. Officers hesitated, but slowly the order spread. Guns wavered. Fingers hovered over triggers. The Zero was coming in to land an enemy, unarmed and alive, tempting what no pilot had ever dared, above the deck. Tadayoshi Koga fought every gust of wind and every failing mechanism in his aircraft. The engine coughed and sputtered, oil. Pressure falling steadily. He adjusted the stick, nudging the Zero into a shallow bank, desperately lining it with the carrier's bow. His vision blurred from sweat and smoke, but he didn't dare look away. Every second that ticked past brought the deck closer, closer to salvation or disaster. On deck, the landing signal officer, paddles raised, froze in disbelief. How could he guide an enemy aircraft safely onto the carrier? Orders were shouted, alarms blared, but no one moved to shoot. The men on deck held their collective breath. 50 feet, 30, 20, the Zero wobbled. Smoke curling from its cowling tail, hooks scraping dangerously close to the deck. Koga's hands shook violently as he eased back on the throttle, coaxing the aircraft down. The engine coughed one last time and quit. The deck rose to meet him. Sailors flinched instinctively. The arresting wires glimmered under the morning sun. The Zero slammed onto the wooden surface with a bone-jarring metallic crack, bouncing once, skidding sideways, wheels screaming against the deck. Tailhook caught the fourth wire, jerking the plane to an abrupt halt. Silence followed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Ensign Tadayoshi Koga remained in the cockpit, trembling, barely able to comprehend that he was alive. Sailors stared, jaws agape, struggling to process the impossible. A Japanese pilot had just landed on an American craft carrier without a single shot fired. The first cautious movements began. Sailors approached, rifles raised, but fingers off triggers. Koga raised his hand slowly, trembling. Commander Dixon stepped forward. "Secure the pilot. He's ours." Below deck, Koga was escorted into a small compartment, expecting brutality. He was instead offered water and basic medical care. His heart pounded as a medic cleaned the cut above his eyebrow. All calm professionalism, no threats, no shouting. Koga sipped the cold water, disbelief etched on his young face. Every command, every propaganda leaflet he had ever read screamed that Americans were monsters. Yet here a simple act of humanity challenged everything he had believed. Word of the Zero's capture spread quickly. Engineers crowded around the aircraft on deck, marveling at the minimalistic design, its thin metal skin and exposed fuel lines. Every observation whispered secrets about its Japanese engineering that could shift the course of the Pacific War. Koga's heart ached at the thought. It's the aircraft he had flown, the pride of Japan, now an intelligence treasure for the enemy. And yet, amidst the chaos and disbelief, one truth anchored him. He was alive. Survival, against all odds, had kept him breathing. The morning after the impossible landing, USS Bogue was alive with activity. Captured Zero had become the centerpiece of every conversation, every glance, every careful step taken across. The flight deck? Its engineers and intelligence officers swarmed over it like moths to a flame. Its cameras clicked, panels were removed, and measurements were logged with feverish precision. Every rivet, every wire, every inch of Japanese engineering was meticulously recorded. Below deck, Koga sat in his compartment, staring blankly at the metal bulkhead. Each echo of footsteps above reminded him that his aircraft, the very symbol of his skill and honor, was being torn apart piece by piece, studied, dissected. The shame pressed on him, suffocating. But beneath it lay another, quieter truth. He was alive. He had survived the impossible. He had landed on an enemy carrier, unharmed, captured not by bullets, but by chance and courage. Commander Dixon, Chief Engineer Addison, and other officers moved with deliberate care around the Zero. Dixon's eyes were steady, calculating. This aircraft could change everything for the U.S. Navy. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, almost to himself, "this may be the most valuable landing of the entire war." Addison grinned as he inspected the engine mounts. "Look at the weight." "Savings," he muttered. "No armor, fuel lines exposed, controls simplified, everything minimal. No wonder it climbs like a demon." On the flight deck above, sailors watched the disassembly with fascination. Some touched the wings, marveling at the lightness of the metal. Others peered into the cockpit, imagining the maneuvers that had flown over enemy skies. The intelligence. Officers discussed strategies, imagining how this one captured aircraft could save hundreds, maybe thousands, of American lives. Meanwhile, Koga's escort arrived. A Japanese-speaking officer who had translated during the morning approached and sat beside him on the bunk. "You were taught that surrender is worse than death," he said gently. Koga lowered his gaze. "Yes," he whispered. "But yesterday, you saw something different." The officer continued. "This is not cruelty or weakness. It is humanity. You are alive, and alive is not dishonor." Koga's eyes stung. He had been trained to resist, to die rather than be taken. And yet, here he was, alive, treated with calm professionalism, offered water, medical care, and words of reason instead of rage. It was a revelation he could scarcely comprehend. On deck, the Zero was carefully lowered into the hangar bay for transport back to port. Engineers continued to dismantle it for study. Measurements were taken, photographs snapped, notes scribbled. Koga imagined the aircraft in pieces, its secrets laid bare, every component analyzed to inform the strategies and tactics of a war he had once fought fiercely to win. The morning sun glittered off the calm Philippine Sea, indifferent to the monumental events aboard the Bogue, yet aboard that ship. Every man knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, the capture of a living legend. A fighter pilot who had flown courage into the impossible, and the aircraft that could change the war below deck. Koga pressed his hand against the cold metal bulkhead as if to anchor himself to reality. The world he had known, the honor, the air, the pride of his aircraft, the loyalty to his homeland was gone. What remained was survival. And that survival, a quiet defiance. Even as the USS Bogue carried on with its mission, Koga's mind remained tangled in disbelief. The events of the previous day refused to fade, looping over and over in his thoughts like a film stuck on its final frame. He had taken off from Formosa with purpose, trained for precision, prepared to strike. Yet here he was, a prisoner aboard an enemy carrier, alive only because of a bizarre twist of fate. The irony was not lost on him. He had survived what? It should have been certain death, and now his pride, his Zero. The very emblem of his skill and honor was in enemy hands above him. The hum of activity never ceased. Sailors sprinted across the flight deck. Engines roared as aircraft were launched and recovered, and the captured Zero, now stripped of panels and partially disassembled, sat in the hangar bay as the object of intense scrutiny. Koga listened to the metallic echoes of wrenches, hammers, and careful inspection. Every sound reminded him that his aircraft, was being unraveled for study, every secret laid bare. And yet, he could not feel anger, not fully, always, in the meticulous care with which the Americans treated the plane. They were thorough, precise, almost reverent, and in that, he glimpsed a sliver of respect he had never expected. A Japanese-speaking officer, the same translator from before, entered the compartment quietly. "Koga-san," he said softly, "you've seen that they are not barbarians. They treat you as a man, and they will study your plane as carefully as they treat you. This is survival, not shame." Koga's hands clenched, the cold metal of the bulkhead pressing into his palms. I was taught that to be captured is disgrace," he whispered, voice barely audible. "Perhaps," the officer replied, "but you are alive. Alive is not shame, alive is chance. And sometimes the smallest chance can shift the course of war." Koga swallowed hard, absorbing the words. They cut through the fog of fear and indoctrination, leaving a strange clarity. He had failed his mission, failed his homeland, yet he had achieved something no one could have planned: survival and, unwittingly, a gift to the Americans, an intact Zero, a tool that could turn the tide of air combat. Above deck, the engineers continued their meticulous work. Addison wiped his hands on a rag, muttering observations about weight, fuel lines, and aerodynamics. "This plane climbs like a demon," he whispered to a fellow officer. "Every ounce of armor sacrificed for maneuverability." The pilots who flew this, they were something else entirely. The crew around the hangar bay marveled. Photographs were taken, notes scribbled, the very air charged with a sense of discovery. Koga, sitting in his compartment, imagined the Zero's secrets spilling out like water from a broken dam. Every panel removed, every measurement taken, was knowledge that could save American lives. Yeah, the knowledge of what he had lost pressed heavily upon him: pride, duty, honor, and the mission that had brought him into the sky that morning. The Philippine seas stretched calm and endless beyond the porthole. Koga traced the horizon with his eyes, thinking of home, of the family who believed him dead, of comrades lost to war. Kay had survived, but at a cost heavier than he could yet measure. Survival was no victory. It was a fragile, trembling thread, holding him between shame and the impossible gift of life, even now. As the sun glinted off the carrier's deck and the captured Zero gleamed in the hangar bay, Koga understood that the world had shifted beneath him. One wrong heading, one desperate landing, one moment of mercy from the enemy. And he had changed the course of the Pacific War, all because he had lived. The USS Bogue sailed steadily through the calm Philippine Sea. Below deck, Koga's thoughts churned with the weight of what had transpired. He had survived a flight that should have killed him, crash-landed on an enemy carrier, and watched his precious Zero stripped apart under the hands of the very men he had been trained to fight. Yet amid this chaos of conflicting emotions, a subtle realization began to settle within him. Survival had meaning beyond honor or shame. Koga had expected mockery, threats, even violence, but instead, he was treated with a measured, almost clinical courtesy. Medics had cleaned his wounds, offered him water and food. Officers had asked questions about his condition, his flight, and the events of the morning, never about strategy, never about secrets he could not give. For the first time, he saw the enemy not as faceless monsters, but as men disciplined, capable, and human. The Zero, meanwhile, had become a marvel in the eyes of the Americans. Panels removed, instruments inspected, and measurements logged, the aircraft was no longer just a weapon. It was intelligence gold. Engineers marveled at its weight-saving construction, its exposed fuel lines, its maneuverability. No armor, every ounce designed for agility, Addison said, inspecting the engine mounts. It's terrifyingly effective. Above, the carrier's flight deck hummed with life. Planes launched and recovered, sailors moved with precision. And yet, the captured Zero drew constant attention. It was not just an airplane. It was proof of Japanese ingenuity, a symbol of fear turned into opportunity. Every detail extracted from the aircraft would give American pilots an edge in combat, potentially saving countless lives. Koga's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what his miscalculation had caused the loss of his plane to the enemy. The exposure of Japanese engineering secrets, the blow to national pride. And yet, there was an undeniable comfort in knowing he had survived. The Japanese-speaking officer who had escorted him entered again. "Koga-san, you are alive. It's not defeat, it's not defiance. Life is a weapon of its own. Use it wisely." Koga bowed slightly, absorbing the words. It was an unfamiliar perspective, yet it resonated deeply. He had been trained to die for honor, yet, in living, he had inadvertently influenced the course of the war. The captured Zero, now disassembled and studied, would inform American tactics, improve their pilots' survival, and perhaps prevent the deaths of many. One pilot's survival, one wrong heading, one act of mercy, ripples that extended far beyond the Philippine Sea. Later, Koga was led to a small observation room where he could watch the engineers work on his aircraft. Each movement, each inspection, was a reminder that the Zero's secrets were being transformed into strategic advantage. And yet, he felt a measure of pride in the precision of his aircraft, in the engineering brilliance that had once been feared by American pilots. For Koga, the impact of that single day was both personal and historic. He had failed his mission in the eyes of Japan, but in the process, he had lived. He had seen humanity in the enemy, witnessed the care with which lives and machines were treated, understood that survival could carry consequences far beyond personal honor. As night fell over the Philippine Sea, Koga sat quietly in his bunk. The hum of engines and the distant chatter of sailors above reminded him that life aboard the carrier moved on relentlessly. And somewhere deep within, he realized that his capture was not merely an end, it was the beginning of something new. A lesson in survival, in humanity, and in the unpredictable twists of fate that war imposed upon every man in the sky. The next morning, the USS Bogue rose with the sun over the endless blue of the Philippine Sea. Koga awoke to the distant roar of engines, the flapping of signal flags, and the rhythmic thrum of a war machine that never rested. Today, the engineers planned to reassemble parts of the captured Zero in a simulated flight configuration. Koga knew what that meant. The plane that had been his pride, his instrument of war, was being dissected to reveal every secret it held. He swallowed hard, feeling a mix of dread and a strange curiosity. Up on the flight deck, the crew moved with rehearsed precision. Kaysen and his team of engineers worked feverishly, snapping panels into place, running cables, and photographing each component. "Look at this control linkage," Addison muttered, shaking his head. "Incredible, perfect balance, minimal resistance." The Japanese pilots had a real genius for flight feel. Crewmen crowded around, peering into the cockpit, tracing wires, inspecting instruments, every motion a testament to methodical expertise. Koga was brought up from his quarters under careful escort. Kay walked along the deck, observing his own Zero being treated like a relic, yet with reverence. He expected anger, ridicule, maybe even contempt. Instead, he saw fascination. Sailor? Each officer treated the aircraft with respect, acknowledging the brilliance of what they had once feared in battle. It was surreal, the enemy who had caused him so much fear, now studying what he had flown with meticulous admiration. As Koga observed, Commander Dixon approached him. "Son, I need you to see this," he said, his voice firm yet calm. He led Koga to a mock-up of the flight configuration where engineers simulated control responses. The Zero moved under careful manipulation, and Koga's stomach tightened. He recognized the subtle nuances, the delicate balance that made the aircraft lethal. "This is exactly how you would have flown it in combat," Dixon said quietly. Every move, every response, precise. Koga's chest tightened. His hands itched to touch the controls, to feel the familiar tug of the stick, the hum of the engine beneath him. But he remained silent, knowing that this was no longer his plane, no longer his mission. He was merely an observer now, a young pilot whose errors had altered history. Below deck, engineers tested the engine, measuring its output, evaluating the aerodynamics, mapping fuel efficiency, and documenting everything with feverish precision. The Zero, once a harbinger of death for countless American pilots, had become a key to survival for thousands more. Each revelation, each discovery, was a stark reminder of what had been at stake and what Koga had unwittingly preserved. A young sailor, barely older than Koga, approached him cautiously. "Sir, it's incredible to think someone flew this and survived," he said, eyes wide. Koga nodded, swallowing back emotion. The boy's words struck him harder than any insult or praise, a recognition that life, even for an enemy, was remarkable. Commander Dixon signaled for Koga to watch as a mock flight simulation was conducted. The Zero, controlled by engineers via test rigs, moved gracefully, mimicking maneuvers that had once dominated skies over the Pacific. Koga felt a pang of both pride and sorrow. His skill, his aircraft, his mission, all were dissected, transformed into knowledge that could save lives. He realized, for the first time, that his survival and inadvertent contribution were far more valuable than any victory. He might have won in the air, the day dragged on with relentless activity. Koga moved quietly among the engineers, answering technical questions only when necessary. His answer, each observation, reinforced the paradox of his situation. Captured, yet essential. Failure, yet invaluable. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the deck, and Koga felt the weight of the day settle into his shoulders. He had lived, and in living, he had changed the Pacific War forever, not through fire or fury, but by being alive and by trusting fate to guide him in that impossible landing. Even as night settled over the Philippine Sea, the USS Bogue remained, alive with motion. The hum of engines, the clatter of metal, and the distant voices of sailors gave the carrier a pulse that Koga could feel through the deck beneath his feet. Below deck, the hangar bay buzzed with activity as the engineers continued to probe every inch of the captured Zero. Panels were removed and replaced, cables measured, instruments recalibrated. It was a surgical operation on a machine that had once been an instrument of war, now a key to survival. Koga, still fragile from the crash landing and the ordeal that followed, had been allowed a brief walk on the flight deck. The wind was sharp against his face, carrying the salty temps of the sea, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a deep breath. He scanned the horizon, thinking of Japan, his family, and the life he had left behind. A wave of guilt washed over him, the shame of failure, of surrender, of leaving his mission incomplete. But alongside it was another feeling, a stubborn spark of survival. Against all odds, was still alive. The Japanese-speaking officer who had guided him since the morning approached quietly. "Koga-san," he said, voice low but steady. "Do you understand what has happened today? If your survival has given your enemy insight, yes, but it has also preserved your life. There is value in life, even when honor seems lost." Koga looked at him, meeting his calm eyes. For the first time, he began to grasp that war was not always about glory or death. Sometimes, it was about endurance, observation, and unexpected influence. On deck, engineers conducted tests on the Zero's control surfaces. They moved the ailerons, flaps, and rudder in precise sequences, noting every response. Koga's stomach twisted as he saw the aircraft respond as he had flown it, the machine behaving exactly as it had in his hands, yet now under the scrutiny of others. Addison wiped his brow, muttering to a fellow engineer, "If only we had known these details before." The implication was clear. Hundreds of American lives could have been spared. Strategies improved, all because a young Japanese pilot had survived a seemingly impossible ordeal. Koga's mind wandered back to the flight itself, to the moment when he had seen the American carrier rise below him, and how he had lowered his landing gear in desperation. The memory made his pulse quicken, the terror, the uncertainty, and the surreal calm of that instant when he realized he had no choice but to trust fate. He had gambled everything on a single decision, and somehow he had won against every expectation, against every instinct drilled into him as a soldier. Later, the deck crew carefully lowered sections of the Zero into a test rig below. Koga was allowed to observe, though at a distance. Every screw, every cable, every control linkage was documented. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. This single aircraft, once a symbol of Japanese air superiority, was now a cornerstone for American tactical advantage. The irony was not lost on him. The same plane he had flown in deadly combat would now be used to save lives, including those of pilots who had been his enemies. Commander Dixon appeared beside Koga once more. "Son, you did something today that no one else could. You survived. And in surviving, you changed the game. The Zero will teach us. But you are part of that story now." Koga's chest tightened. Words of praise, even delivered without mockery, were foreign and uncomfortable. He had been trained to expect death, to embrace it as duty. Yet here was a strange recognition, an acknowledgement of value beyond combat, beyond honor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long reflections across the Black Sea, Koga stood silently, absorbing the lessons of the day. The Zero sat partially disassembled nearby, its metal skin gleaming in the dim light. War was still raging all around, but in this moment, survival, observation, and unexpected impact had become its own kind of victory. Koga realized that the actions of a single individual, no matter how small or unintended, could echo far beyond their immediate scope. The following days aboard the USS Bogue unfolded with a rhythm that was almost surreal to Koga. Each morning, he awoke to the steady hum of the carrier, the shuffle of sailors, and the distant roar of aircraft engines. Below deck, the Zero had become the center of a whirlwind of activity. Engineers and intelligence officers moved with urgency, documenting every component, measuring every system, and running simulations to understand the aircraft's secrets. Koga watched quietly, realizing that what he had once flown as a weapon of war had transformed into a tool that might save countless lives. Koga's initial fear and shame began to soften into a complicated mixture of curiosity and reluctant pride. He was still a prisoner, still an enemy, yet he felt a strange connection to the people who studied his plane. They were meticulous, respectful, almost reverent in their examination of the Zero. Every observation, every note they took underscored the significance of his survival. The very fact that the aircraft had landed intact, unscathed by gunfire, had made it possible for this intelligence windfall. In a way, Koga realized he had not failed. He had inadvertently contributed to a larger purpose, Commander Dixon. And Captain Giles continued to consult Koga through a translator. They asked about maneuvers, flight performance, and technical details. Koga answered cautiously, aware that each piece of information he provided could shape the outcomes of future air battles. Yet, with each answer, he began to sense a shift. In the perception of the Americans around him, no longer was he simply an enemy pilot. He was a source of insight, a living testament to the human side of war. Below deck, Koga began to observe the engineers as they tested the Zero's engine and control surfaces. They were thorough, almost obsessive, checking every linkage, every wire, every hinge. He noted how carefully they treated the aircraft, handling it with care, documenting even minor scratches and dings. One engineer tapped the wing lightly. "Light as paper," he muttered. Another shook his head at the carburetor. "Incredible climb. No wonder it outperformed our planes early on." Koga swallowed. His aircraft, his pride, had been disassembled and analyzed. Yet the reverence they showed made him understand that survival could have meaning beyond personal glory or failure. At night, in the quiet of his compartment, Koga reflected on what had happened. His landing had been accidental, desperate, and dangerous, yet it had created a bridge between enemies. He thought of the crew who had guided him safely, the medics, who had treated him without cruelty, and the officers who had sought knowledge rather than vengeance. Every interaction had shattered the image of the Americans that Japanese propaganda had instilled in him. They were not monsters. They were men capable of reason, decency, and even empathy. Word of the captured Zero spread throughout the carrier group. Koga became a silent observer of history in motion. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, and every discovery sent intelligence rippling back to the United States. The aircraft that had once symbolized fear and dominance now represented insight and preparation. Koga felt a complex blend of shame, relief, and awe. He had been trained to die rather than surrender, yet survival had given his enemies a gift and had preserved his life. He had become part of a narrative far larger than himself, one where war, fate, and humanity intersected in unexpected ways. By the end of the week, Koga had begun to adjust to his new reality. Meals were regular, quarters more comfortable, and his interactions with the crew, though cautious, became routine. He no longer trembled at each footstep on the deck above. Instead, he observed, listened, and reflected. The Zero, now disassembled and catalogued, had become a symbol of both the relentless machine of war and the fragile human life caught within it. Koga understood, at last, that while missions could fail and honor could be questioned, survival and contribution had their own quiet, lasting power. As the USS Bogue steamed steadily toward port, the reality of Koga's situation began to sink. And word of his capture had already reached intelligence headquarters. Now preparations were being made for the Zero and its pilot to be transferred to the United States for detailed study. Koga's life had been spared, Yet he could not escape the shadow of what awaited him, both in the eyes of the Americans and, eventually, in Japan. The shame of survival weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the mission he had failed. The days aboard the carrier were filled with quiet observation and careful attention. Koga was allowed to move freely in designated areas, speak with the translators, and witness the ongoing disassembly and analysis of his aircraft. Sailors would occasionally glance at him with curiosity, whispering about the young pilot who had landed a Zero on an American deck without being shot. Koga felt a strange mixture of alienation and recognition. He was both prisoner and participant, server and subject, caught in a world where the rules he had known no longer applied. In the hangar bay, engineers marveled at every detail. The Zero. Addison leaned over the engine compartment, muttering about weight reduction, climb rate, and maneuverability. Koga observed silently, noting how the Americans approached the aircraft with precision and respect, as if uncovering the secret of a rare and precious artifact rather than disassembling a weapon. Each rivet, panel, and wire was documented meticulously. The intelligence officers took careful notes, their excitement barely contained as they realized the implications of their discovery. Every test, every measurement, had the potential to save lives in the ongoing Pacific campaign. Evenings brought a different kind of challenge for Koga, alone in his compartment. He wrestled with the knowledge that Japan would almost certainly declare him dead. Reports of missing pilots were common, and he would now become a ghost to his family, a name erased from the roster. As a soldier who had survived but failed in the eyes of his homeland, the weight of isolation was compounded by the surreal kindness he had been shown. No threats, no harsh words, just human decency. Something he had been taught to distrust. Conversations with the Japanese-speaking officer became a lifeline. "You were trained to fight, to die, to protect your country," the officer said gently. "But survival is also an act of courage. You have preserved your life and, in doing so, changed the course of this war in ways no one anticipated." Koga listened, absorbing the words but struggling to reconcile them with his own understanding of honor. In his mind, he had failed, yet he could not deny the truth. The Zero's capture had already altered the strategic landscape, giving the Americans knowledge they had never possessed before. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, black and calm under the night sky. The Bogue cut through the waves, a floating city of technology and discipline, carrying both the living pilot and the disassembled aircraft that had once been feared across the Pacific. Koga watched the crew moving above deck, realizing that war was no longer simply about dogfights and missions. It was about intelligence, adaptation, the fragile human choices that could tip the balance in unexpected ways. For Koga, the future remained uncertain. Would Japan accept him if he returned? Would his survival be seen as cowardice? Yet as he lay on his bunk, listening to the hum of engines and the faint clatter of sailors' footsteps, he understood something profound. Survival, observation, and humanity had value beyond the battlefield. In a war defined by death and destruction, a single breath, a single decision, and an unlikely landing on a foreign carrier had reshaped not only his destiny but the course of the Pacific War itself. The night deepened, and the carrier pressed. Koga closed his eyes, exhausted yet strangely alive. The Zero, now a collection of panels, engines, and memories, sat below deck, silent and powerless. Yet its story and his would echo far beyond the ocean, a testament to the unpredictable, surreal, and deeply human currents that ran through war. Weeks later, the USS Bogue finally docked at a secure port, and preparations began to transport the captured Zero and Koga to the United States. For the young pilot, every step felt unreal. The war he had known in the skies of Okinawa, filled with smoke, bullets, and adrenaline, had been replaced by procedure, analysis, and an eerie calm. He walked the deck one last time, observing the sailors who had once guided him safely, treated him kindly, and now waved goodbye with a mixture of respect and curiosity. The Zero, stripped of its panels and carefully crated, would travel across the ocean to laboratories and airfields where its secrets would be studied and catalogued. American engineers would test its limits, learn its weaknesses, and develop strategies that could save countless lives. Koga, once a feared enemy pilot, had inadvertently become a bridge between nations, a living symbol of the strange twists, fate that war could produce. As he was escorted onto the transport plane, Koga reflected on what survival had taught him. Honor, courage, and duty were no longer defined solely by death or victory. Sometimes, living, observing, and allowing knowledge to pass from one side to the other could have consequences far greater than a single mission. He carried with him the weight of his homeland's expectations, yet also the quiet reassurance that he had survived, and, in surviving, had influenced history. The plane lifted into the sky, the hum of the engines familiar yet foreign. Below, the vast Pacific stretched endlessly, a reminder of battles fought, lives lost, and fortunes changed by a single twist of fate. Koga closed his eyes, feeling the tremor of the ocean and the pulse of the ship that had saved him. For Ensign Tadayoshi Koga, the war was far from over, but he had learned a truth few others ever would, that sometimes survival and a single, courageous, improbable act could rewrite the story of the sky.